seems there's some significance to the number 40. In terms of time in the Bible, we hear about 40 as a passage of time many times throughout the Old Testament. We can look back to Genesis. We probably all know the story of Noah, that God sent a flood over the earth. He sent rain for 40 days and 40 nights to flood the earth, essentially to renew it. We can even look into Exodus, the second book of the Bible, and we hear about how Moses, as he was leading the people of Israel, he was called to go up the mountain, and for 40 days and 40 nights he fasted on the mountain and communed with God, and at the end of that received the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. And we can even go further than that. Also in Exodus, we hear that that's 40 years. 40 years is spent in the desert by the Israelites, wandering, working towards the Promised Land. So it seems like there'd be some significance. So what does 40 mean? Well, if we look at it, 40 in Judaism kind of assumes that it's a complete passage of time. It says in some kind of regard that 40 kind of points to that it's a complete passage of time. That's just a small amount of time, not a long period of time, but there's a complete passage of time. But also, too, it also alludes that when we hear 40, something significant is happening. Something is significant that's happening in the life of God and in salvation history. Pope Benedict, he also adds to this as well. He wrote a series of books called Jesus of Nazareth. And in one part of it, he's talking about the temptation, and he talks about 40 especially. So he says that 40 is actually a cosmic number. If we go back to the early church, what we call the church fathers, and the church fathers we could call the early bishops of the church, so maybe like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, we even go up to maybe Augustine. They always considered 40 as a cosmic number, that it kind of reminds us of all of creation. And they take this, they say that, and back in those days they were thought to have 4 corners of the world. You probably have heard that, there's 4 corners of the world. But also the 10 Commandments, and they would kind of say like with those 2 numbers, there's some significance. They add them together and they get 40. So that is a cosmological number, and it also says that there's something that's going to be here that's happening significantly. And so that makes sense as we come into today, because Jesus, again, we hear that number 40 in the New Testament. And so this is not insignificant. But especially with Jesus, it's not just pointing to something that's going to happen for his life, but this is going back to the Old Testament. 40 is meant to point us towards, hey, Jesus is coming to do something incredible that's going to fulfill what happened in the Old Testament. So here we have Jesus in the desert here, and he's going through and he's being tempted. And there's something that's not only just happening in his life, but it's calling us back to the Old Testament once again. And it's something about a role that he's taking on. He's actually taking on 2 titles today, especially. We might have heard about it before, the new Adam and the new Moses. You may have heard him called that before, the new Adam and the new Moses. So Jesus has been called the new Adam, and it actually makes sense, because today we hear in this first reading, we're hearing about Adam. And what happens with Adam? Well, he is the first man of creation, so he's the first Adam. And, well, he kind of has a little bit of a problem. He kind of runs into a great problem, the fall. So what happens with Adam and Eve is that they're given this opportunity. The devil tempts them with this fruit, and they fall. But there's something significant about this, because we hear 3 things about this fruit. And they kind of point us back to a little word called concupiscence. Now, concupiscence is maybe we can say it's the kind of tendency for us to sin. We have concupiscence. We can't get away from it. That we have this tendency to sin. And there's a 3-fold way that we find concupiscence in our life. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. So let's look at this fruit, because we hear it described, because Adam and Eve look at this and they say, well, a couple things. They say, well, it's good for food. That's kind of lust of the flesh, something that we yearn for in our bodies. The second is it's pleasing to the eye. So that's like the lust of the eye. Sometimes we see something. That's where greed comes from. But also, too, it's desirable for wisdom. So if we see this, we could be really powerful, the pride of life. So those 3 things, Adam and Eve, they fall to. But Jesus, of course, is the new Adam, and he is not like Adam in the fact that he doesn't have this tendency to sin, because he is God incarnate. So what happens here is that, Jesus is in the desert. He fasts for 40 days and 40 nights, and then he's tempted in 3 ways. The first we hear is that he's given, the devil comes up to him and says, I command you, turn this stone to bread. That kind of sounds, bread kind of sounds like lust of the flesh. We hear about that. And Jesus says, no, one does not live on bread alone. He denies that. He overcomes that temptation. Well, he's also, a second time, he's tempted. The devil takes him up to the parapet of the temple and says, throw yourself down, make a spectacle, show your power. Well, that's the pride of life. Sometimes we want to have that celebrity. We want to show our power. And Jesus says, I will not do that. He comes back with humility. And then the third one, Jesus is taken up to a high mountain with the devil, and he's seeing all the kingdoms of the world, and the devil says to him, these kingdoms, you can have all of this. And I've always kind of wondered about this, because Jesus already has that, but nonetheless, Jesus overcomes that temptation. It's this is not what I'm here for. So we see that Jesus, even where Adam fell, this new Adam succeeds, and he overcomes sin. He overcomes temptation. So that's the great news, is that where we may fall, where human nature has fallen, where our human folly has fallen, Jesus overcomes and restores. That's the new Adam. But also I said he has another title, the new Moses. And that goes back to those 40 years. Those 40 years first off, Jesus also, like Moses, spent 40 days and 40 nights fasting. So Moses did the same thing. But then also we can look at these 40 years in the desert. The people of Israel in that book of Exodus, they are in slavery for 400 years. And then Moses helps lead them out of slavery and into the desert, where they will go to the promised land. But they wander about for 40 years. And they're not always faithful in those 40 years. That's kind of the story of Israel. They continually kind of fall into idolatry, and they keep turning their back on God because they don't feel they can trust Him. Well, where those 40 years, where the Israelites failed in their 40 years, we see Jesus goes beyond that. He turns it on its head. Because although the new Moses was, he was good in his efforts, he was imperfect, our new Moses is perfect. And so as the Israelites failed in the desert, well, Jesus overcomes that. So today, that's where we stand. We are the new Israel. And the news about us is that sometimes we're like the old Israel. Sometimes we fail to trust in the Lord. Sometimes we turn our back, maybe even turn to idolatry, new idolatry. And so maybe we're earnest about that. Sometimes it may even be this. Sometimes we are earnest. We want to please the Lord, and we maybe even come to the confessional. We say, I keep confessing the same thing over and over. I don't feel like I can overcome this. We can overcome it on our own. But if we look to this gospel today, we look to this season of Lent, we're reminded that we can't overcome it on our own, because it's only Jesus who can. So today, that's the good news. Maybe the good news is recognizing our humility, like our Lord did in the desert, is that we can humble ourselves and realize that we don't have the power, but we can rely on the Lord's power. And the more that we do that, the more we allow to humble ourselves and to rely on the Lord's power, then we may find that we'll be able to overcome those temptations of sin, because it's not our power, but it's the Lord's. So today, we look to the new Adam and to the new Moses during these significant times of 40 days and 40 nights. And we call to mind that as we go along our Lenten disciplines, as we go along our lives to try to overcome sin and to make ourselves more holy, is that we don't have to do it on our own, because we can't. And it's because that we should and we can beautifully rely on the Lord, who gives us the power.